$250 million civil fraud trial against the former president, and his business took an even more personal turn today. As we mentioned in the last hour, that guy, that was Donald Trump Jr., the ex-president's oldest son, took the stand this afternoon, answering questions about his responsibilities as Trump Org executive vice president. Donald Trump Jr., who's not just a witness but also a defendant in the case, was the first of the Trump family members expected to take the stand over the next week. In the middle of the night, the ex-president posted on his social media platform a message to the judge in this case to leave his kids alone. They're not just innocent bystanders or kids. They are current and or former high-level employees of the Trump Organization who, according to New York Attorney General Letitia James's lawsuit, were deeply enmeshed in the fraud scheme. Quote, as executive vice presidents, the three children were intimately involved in the operation of the Trump Organization's business. They were aware of the true financial performance of the company, whether through Donald Trump Jr.'s work on commercial leasing, Ivanka Trump's work on Doral, Trump Chicago and the old post office, or Eric Trump's work on the golf course portfolio. The lawsuit adds this, quote, and in their roles as executive vice presidents, each of the three Trump children have familiarity with, responsibility for, and made use of the statements of financial condition in commercial transactions. A conclusion that contradicts Donald Jr.'s deposition from last year, a clip of which we played at the top. Here's what comes next in that conversation when Donald Trump Jr. denies having any knowledge of accounting principles that would be required for statements of financial condition.
That's pretty much what I remember from Accounting 101. So.
Have you told me everything you know about GAAP?
Basically. I'm sure I could come up with some creative stuff to kill time, but I'd be doing neither of us a favor in terms of educating ourselves.
Okay. Thank you. So, fair to say you've never been employed in a position that required you to apply GAAP to your work?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Wow. Little reminder as we go through Don Jr.'s testimony today. The judge has already decided, he has already ruled that fraud happened, that fraud was committed. That is settled. What's on trial now is how much the Trumps owe for their fraudulent behavior. Donald Trump Jr. taking the stand in the New York civil fraud trial is where we begin the hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. New York Times investigative reporter Sue Craig is back with us. Plus, senior editor for Bloomberg Opinion Tim O'Brien is here. And our friend, former top official at DOJ, Andrew Weissmann, is back with us. Andrew Weissmann, Donald Trump Jr. as a witness, helpful, hurtful, neither?
It remains to be seen, how he comes off on the stand. But here's why I think the New York Attorney General is calling him. So one, he is a defendant. And so it is useful for them to present his testimony and to confront him with the documents and have the judge make a credibility call. It also protects them on appeal if the judge finds that any of the so-called children or Donald Trump himself are not credible. That's a very hard thing for a court of appeals to reverse because they won't see the witness. They haven't had a chance to experience it. So it's a smart move for the Attorney General to present them as witnesses and to cross-examine them with these documents. It also, though, it is just wrong for someone to say, gee, these are just children that the Attorney General is just calling for, just to harass the father. These were people who had very senior positions in a family-run business. And so they're entitled to be grilled about what they knew. And as you said, Nicole, because he has already found on the first cause of action that there's fraud, he's entitled to hear from them, and the AG is entitled to cross-examine them on what they knew about various aspects of the fraud that the court has already found.
Sue, this is the schedule for the week. Don Jr. today, that may carry over, I think, right, to tomorrow. Eric Trump tomorrow, Donald Trump on Monday, and Ivanka Trump next Wednesday. Let's start with today. What did Donald Trump Jr. say?
Well, and he's going to carry over into tomorrow. We're still on his direct. But he started, it's interesting, and I think it's important to set the table for the three of them, and I'm not sure if the timing of them is significant because of what I'm about to say. But Donald Jr. just hasn't been that much of a presence in the trial. You really do see the fingerprints more of Eric Trump and Ivanka in various deals. Very few people have brought up Donald Trump Jr. That isn't to say he isn't involved. And how it started out today was they just first of all went through, as they always do, some biographical information. And then they established him, and this is what becomes important, as the trustee of the trust that was set up when Donald Trump went into office. He was one of the trustees, and as a result of being one of the trustees, he had a lot of oversight, including on banking relationships and ostensibly on these statements of financial conditions that we've heard so much about, that were inflated and then submitted to the banks to get potentially better rates at the banks, at the insurance companies. And he has said, he's maintained, that he did not have a role in preparing the statements of financial condition. But today he really, and I think we were sort of getting to just a climax right at the end, and it's going to pick up tomorrow because a lot of it was very, it was, wouldn't quite say boring, but there was no excitement. There were no Perry Mason moments. But then they lead it up, at the end they were leading up to this moment where he was trying to thread this needle, where he wasn't involved in the preparing of the statement of financial conditions, but he may have been in meetings where the valuations were discussed, but he didn't know that it was going to go to the statement of financial conditions. And I have to say, throughout the 2 hours or so that he was up, he was actually, a good witness in terms of he stayed calm through the questioning. He made some jokes, but he got pretty animated at that last point. You could see that that's sort of where the Attorney General is now trying, at least, in the last, could carry over tomorrow, to turn the screw a bit on him, and exactly what was his role in the preparation of the financial statements. Even if he's saying he didn't know that maybe that information was going into a financial statement, but she's trying to establish he was in some way involved because he is a defendant.
Tim O'Brien, what is Don Jr.'s role in the company?
He does what his father tells him to do, and as does Eric, and as does Ivanka. They're all essentially hostages, and no major decisions were made in the Trump organization without Donald Trump's input, and none of the children would bark unless they had Donald Trump's input. The other thing I think we should focus on is this issue of whether or not Don Jr. was familiar with GAAP is precisely the problem. None of the Trump financial statements comported with GAAP because they were making things up every step of the way. The statement of financial conditions that they gave to the bank said very prominently inside the statements of financial condition, none of this comports with GAAP. And the reason it said that is because their own accountants wouldn't sign off on it. They were not going to put their names on the line to a document that they believed was being used to mislead people. And secondly, Don Jr. has never been a particularly bright bulb. He has trouble doing basic multiplication. You can go to a Howard Stern tape where Don Jr., Ivanka, and the father, Don, the father, were all sitting there, and Howard Stern asked each one of them to multiply 16 times 7, and none of them could do it. And the only one who sort of took joy in being embarrassed in that interview was Don Jr., because I think he authentically doesn't care. As Sue was getting at, I think he's a good witness because he just doesn't care. He's willing to, make light of the question. But at the end of the day, he is a witness against his father in this matter, and he's offering testimony about how they conducted their business, and whether or not he knows the immediate foundations of how GAAP is calculated is actually a problem, because he was more involved, I think, than he said thus far on the stand in terms of determining the kind of valuations they presented to the bank. He was intimately involved in the separation agreement with Alan Weisselberg, in which Weisselberg was promised $2 million in compensation if he didn't testify in part against the family. That agreement has a lot of hinky moments in it that suggest they wanted to make sure he wasn't a problem for them. So Don is involved in the things the prosecution needs him to be involved with, actually, and I don't think his testimony today saves him from anything particularly.